Welcome to the podcast. This is the Low Carb Coach, and I'm going to talk to you today about one of my favourite topics, cholesterol. Now, you're probably thinking, what does cholesterol have to do with carbohydrates? Well, hopefully that will make a little bit more sense as we go along. And just a word of warning, this podcast is a little bit longer than usual, but if you hang in there, I think you'll learn a thing or two about this mystery substance that is apparently killing all of us. Okay, in today's marketing world, I think it's fair to say that poor old cholesterol has a bit of an image problem. Some would say it's a toxic brand to be avoided at all costs. And it's got to be one of the most misunderstood elements of nutrition. In fact, if I asked you to write down 3 things you know about cholesterol, you'd probably write down something like 1, it's bad for you, 2, the lower your cholesterol level, the better, and 3, it causes heart attacks and strokes. Well, don't be embarrassed that you are wrong on all 3 statements. It just means you're like the majority of people when it comes to our collective misunderstanding of cholesterol. So how did we become indoctrinated with the belief that cholesterol is supposedly bad for us? Well, that's a separate podcast in itself about how we were encouraged to change the type of fat in our diet over the past 40 years. But in very simple terms, when we were all encouraged to start eating polyunsaturated fats back in the 1980s, yes, when the first dietary guidelines were released, poor old cholesterol got caught in the crossfire and was demonized as the cause of not only our growing obesity, courtesy of its relationship with saturated fat, but was incorrectly identified as a major risk factor for heart disease and stroke. And the history of how this all happened is fascinating, and I'll stick that in a standalone podcast, but just accept the fact that cholesterol and saturated fat have no relationship other than they are often found in the same foods because they usually come from animal sources. And tragically, it's become part of medical doctrine that eating saturated fat raises your cholesterol level, yet nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it's biologically impossible. Okay. Let's start with the basics and build from there. What actually is cholesterol? Cholesterol is just a bunch of carbon molecules stuck together, 27 of them to be exact. And we've essentially got 2 types of cholesterol in the body. A free form of cholesterol, which is absorbed in the small intestine and is mass produced by the body every day, and a bulkier form of cholesterol that we actually eat. So why am I telling you about the 2 different forms of cholesterol? Well, because the vast majority, around 85% of cholesterol absorbed in the small intestine, is the free form that our body has made, whereas the small amount of cholesterol we've eaten via our diet is too bulky to be absorbed in the gut. So what I hear you say, well, if you are like millions of people over the past couple of generations who have tried to dramatically reduce the amount of cholesterol in your diet, then guess what? Your body just compensates by producing more. Now, if that doesn't make sense, let me put it another way. We eat about 500 milligrams of cholesterol per day. That's the bulky form. But we make about 1,200 milligrams per day. That's the free form. And we store about 50,000 milligrams of cholesterol in the body. So, lowering your cholesterol intake via the food you eat, it's a little bit like removing about half a litre of water out of the standard backyard pool. It makes no difference, and your body says, oh well, I'll just go and make some more. Now think of all those food products that are aggressively marketed as low in cholesterol. It's all just part of a clever marketing scam designed to cash in on our misguided beliefs about cholesterol. So get your head around this. All cells in our body, with the exception of brain cells, are made of and can manufacture cholesterol. Cell membranes, in other words, the walls of our cells, are flexible and fluid in shape. They provide a protective layer around the contents of the cell, and they need to be capable of allowing certain substances into and out of the cell. And all that and more is possible because our cell walls are made of cholesterol. Cholesterol is also responsible for the production of sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and without cholesterol, we wouldn't be able to produce vitamin D, which helps us absorb calcium in the small intestine. Further still, cholesterol is the main component in bile, which is produced by the gallbladder and used to break down fats for digestion. And just in case you need any more convincing of the vital role cholesterol plays in our bodies, remember that the small gaps between our brain cells, otherwise known as our synapses, are almost entirely made of cholesterol. So hopefully you can see that cholesterol plays a pretty important role in our bodies, yet ironically we've been fooled into thinking that cholesterol is bad for us and we need to achieve the lowest blood cholesterol possible in order to avoid heart attacks and strokes. So where did all this thinking come from? Well, a little bit like the whole if you eat fat you'll get fat theory that was proposed in the 1950s and 60s. The simple image of cholesterol clogging our arteries is one that continues to be promoted. Remember how our brains work? If it seems to make sense, then it's easy to accept. Well, doctors would routinely find cholesterol in the arteries around the heart, the coronary arteries, in people who'd experienced a heart attack, and this led them to believe that cholesterol was the culprit. But blaming cholesterol for causing heart attacks is a little bit like blaming firefighters for starting fires. Every time there's a fire, there's also firefighters present. In actual fact, cholesterol targets arteries that are experiencing some form of trauma, like the accumulation of a nasty little critter called a small dense lipoprotein in the artery wall, and more about that soon. And just like firefighters, cholesterol turns up to help repair the damage. It's called an inflammatory response. So where do these small dense LDL particles come from? Well, you might have guessed it already, but I'll tell you, small dense LDL particles are produced from eating a diet high in carbohydrates. But hang on a second, I'm getting a headache. You're thinking, you just mentioned something about lipoproteins. What are they? Well, remember the old saying, oil and water don't mix? Well, this is true for cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid, which is just the technical name for a fat, and because it's a fat, cholesterol cannot freely move around in our bloodstream the same way, say, glucose and sodium do. So it has to be packaged in a way that helps it get transported around the body. So the body is clever insofar as it wraps the cholesterol in a layer of protein. So when you combine cholesterol with a protein, it's known as a lipoprotein. Now, for all the visual learners out there, let me use a container ship to help explain lipoproteins. Let's imagine that the container ship is the lipoprotein that is floating around our bloodstream. The containers on the ship are full of cholesterol and another type of fat known as triglycerides. Now, not all ships are the same size and their cargo varies, but without these lipoprotein container ships, we'd have no way of moving cholesterol and triglycerides around our bodies. Now, in order to kind of avoid mass confusion, let's just concentrate on a couple of different types of lipoproteins. You've probably heard of low density lipoproteins or LDLs and high density lipoproteins or HDLs. Our low density lipoproteins or LDLs are described as large and fluffy because they essentially take up a lot of space, but they have very little mass. What they do have is about 60% of our cholesterol, and their job is to transport that cholesterol to our muscle and our fat cells. The other type of container ship floating around our bloodstream is our high density lipoproteins or HDLs. And this container ship carries significantly less cholesterol. Our HDLs have been called our good cholesterol and our LDLs have been called our bad cholesterol. There's nothing quite like a good versus evil analogy to capture people's attention. None of this is actually true, and it's actually based on the belief that if LDL container ships carry more cholesterol relative to HDLs, then they must be increasing our risk of heart disease. And not surprisingly, this whole good versus bad cholesterol myth has been created and perpetuated by the pharmaceutical industry because guess what? Their drugs, which are designed to supposedly lower cholesterol, only work on low density lipoproteins. So it's kind of convenient to make them the bad guys. So you have these container ships known as lipoproteins floating around our bloodstream, with some carrying more cholesterol than others, trying to find a place to offload their cargo, usually at muscle and fat cells. So far so good. But in amongst these HDL and LDL container ships are smaller ships that sometimes get trapped in the small gaps that line the inside of our artery walls, particularly our coronary arteries, which are the main blood vessels around the outside of the heart. These are the nasty little guys I mentioned earlier, called small dense lipoproteins, or small dense LDLs. So how do I avoid these small dense LDLs, you ask? Well, here's the connection with carbohydrates. The predominant type of carbohydrate consumed in Australia is in the form of sucrose, which to most people is most easily described as stock standard table sugar. Sucrose is what we call a disaccharide, which means it has two parts. One glucose molecule joined with a fructose molecule. But when sucrose is consumed, the bond between fructose and glucose is split, courtesy of the acidic contents of the stomach, which presents a bit of a problem for the body because whilst it can deal with processing glucose, it struggles to deal with the fructose. Why? Because the appetite controlling centre in the brain, called the hypothalamus, doesn't recognise the presence of fructose, which means all the usual mechanisms to tell us to step away from the buffet don't work. And to make matters worse, the liver, which is the only organ brave enough to put its hand up and say, I'll help process fructose, continually converts fructose into excess energy in the form of a fat called triglycerides. So you've eaten some carbohydrate, your brain ignores the usual feelings of fullness, your liver sucks up all the fructose because it can't be processed anywhere else and starts producing excess energy in the form of fat. Now your liver releases shipping containers full of triglycerides into your bloodstream. And your HDLs come along and they offer to lighten the load by taking some of the triglycerides in exchange for some cholesterol. And this process works well, but only up to a certain point, after which our poor old HDL container ships wear out. And as a little bit of a side note here, this is why anyone with a high triglyceride level will always have low HDL levels. They're inversely proportional to each other. So our LDL container ships offer to help the same way. They agree to take on some triglycerides by offloading some cholesterol. But unlike our HDLs that eventually wear out, our LDLs simply shrink in size and become these nasty little guys called small dense LDLs. Now, courtesy of your high carbohydrate intake, you've got an increasing number of small dense LDL boats floating around in your blood. And these small dense LDL particles become embedded in the lining of the arterial wall. When that happens, I think the technical term is all hell breaks loose. You have a cascade of events that results in a whole bunch of what we call macrophage cells. These are the cells that want to engulf and destroy, combining with some other cells to start to produce plaque. And it's that plaque, not cholesterol, that eventually starts to expand the wall of the artery. And if that expansion bursts the inside lining of the artery, then you start to create a blockage. Now, in the case of the carotid artery in the neck, fragments from this blockage of plaque can break off in the form of a clot and potentially travel to the finer blood vessels in the brain, causing a stroke. So, we've covered some ground and hopefully dispelled some myths. Let's pull all this together so you can proudly call yourself a cholesterol expert. Cholesterol is essential for life, and our body makes over 1,000 milligrams of the stuff every day. And in order to float around the body, cholesterol needs to be transported via lipoproteins that vary in size and density. Some lipoproteins, such as low-density lipoproteins, carry more cholesterol than others, such as high-density lipoproteins, but there's no such thing as good and bad cholesterol. Let that myth go. Blaming cholesterol for causing blockages in arteries is completely false. It's not due to cholesterol, but rather an inflammatory response that results from a type of lipoprotein called a small dense LDL being trapped in the arterial wall. And how do you avoid the creation of small dense LDLs? Stop eating large amounts of carbohydrates. Now, just to finish, if you're going to go and get a blood test to check your lipid profile, then stop relying on your total cholesterol level as an indicator of your cardiovascular health. It's akin to essentially sticking your head out the window and trying to predict the weather. It's a waste of time and it's inaccurate. This was the number that was constantly discussed among adults in the 80s and the 90s, and the person with the lowest number, stuck their chest out the furthest. Your total cholesterol is a mixture of the supposedly evil LDL plus your supposedly saintly HDL plus a bunch of other lipoproteins that I've deliberately avoided mentioning. Remember, none of these lipoproteins will predict your risk of heart attack or stroke, but sadly, most GPs will simply look at your total cholesterol level, and if it's lower than 5.5 millimoles per litre, then you'll be allowed to leave without a prescription for a cholesterol-lowering drug called a statin. If it's higher than 7 millimoles per litre, then your GP will probably send for the local priest to issue your last rites. By the way, the history behind the arbitrary cholesterol set point of 5.5 millimoles per litre is a whole standalone podcast. And you'll be staggered at how millions of people have been convinced to take statins over the past 20 to 30 years for very little benefit. So if you don't take any notice of your total cholesterol level, then what do you check? In simple terms, you need to check if there's any evidence of small dense LDLs. If you don't have any small dense LDLs, then, check your superannuation balance, because chances are, notwithstanding any other life-threatening event, you're probably going to be around a little bit longer than you think. So there you have it, a very brief overview of cholesterol. I hope that helps. For more information on how to adopt a low-carb lifestyle, go to lowcarbcoach.com.au. Thanks for listening.